we're going to be in Jeremiah chapter 18 for one of our text passages, but I got a couple of thoughts here that were written by kids. Children were asked to share something in their Sunday school class that they knew about God or that they had learned, and these are totally unedited from children by children. The seventh commandment is, "Thou shalt not admit adultery." Another child said, "A Christian should have only one spouse, and that's called monotony." Another child said, "Adam and Eve were created from an apple." That's interesting. Another child came away from Sunday school and said, "Noah's wife was called Joan of Arc." Another child said, "Lot's wife was a pillar of salt by day and a ball of fire by night." That sounds like they were listening to Pastor Jay teaching there. He teaches heresy from time to time. Let's see. Moses led the Hebrews to the Red Sea, where they made unleavened bread, which is bread without any ingredients. Let's see. The first command. This is good. The first commandment was when Eve told Adam to eat the apple. It's interesting. Let's see. Another child said Moses died before he ever reached Texas. Let's see. Another child said the greatest miracle in the Bible is when Joshua told his son to stand still and he obeyed. Another child said David was a Hebrew king skilled at playing the lyre. He fought with the Frankensteins, which were a race of people who lived in biblical time. Interesting takeaway. A couple more. Solomon, one of David's sons, had 300 wives and 300 porcupines. Might have been from the UP. Let's see, two more. One child said Jesus was born because Mary had an immaculate contraption. And last but not least, Jesus gave the golden rule, which says, "Do unto others before they do unto you." Those are pretty interesting. Jeremiah 18, verses 1 through 6. This is where Jeremiah is commanded by God to go to the potter's house, and we're going to, of course, think about how clay in the hand of the potter is a great example. God said, "This is you, Israel, in my hands." Also a great example of children in the hands of ultimately God being formed. But we're also going to note, as we read this, that every example is just that. It has an example, and sometimes there's some holes. And when viewing a child as a lump of clay, it's not a perfect example. And what we want to see is, though a child is a lump of clay that ultimately is being shaped by the hands that are on it, and there's a lot of different hands that are trying to get on the lump of a child to try to form it and shape it in different ways. Satan and different teachers and philosophies of men that are trying to shape it, also parents and godly teachers. But ultimately, a lump of clay, you could set it on that wheel, you could come back a week later, and the lump of clay is still going to be there. It doesn't move, it doesn't resist the potter's moving and shaping. A child, however, is not a lump of clay. A child is not only acted upon, a child also reacts to the hands that are shaping it. And so that's where the picture does have a few flaws, but nonetheless, it's a great illustration that's worth reading. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, "Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my words." Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he wrought a work on the wheels. And the vessels that he made of clay were marred in the hand of the potter, so he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, "O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? Behold, as the clay is in the hand of the potter, as in the potter's hands, so are ye in my hand, O house of Israel." So many hands are seeking to work their way onto the lump, if we're viewing the lump as a child, to leave its mark while it's still moldable, because there will be a time where that clay gets baked and it's hardened and there is no molding, there's only breaking. And so what we need to understand and what we need to identify is where are the hands coming from, and how can we make sure that the hands that are put on the lump are God's hands ultimately, with the parents and the people that we want ultimately to influence these children. So we're going to look at this evening, and the title of these thoughts are Shaping Influences, the things that influence a child. And we're going to see, though, that influence alone is not what creates a child, but it's also foolish not to recognize that there are things that do come into a child's life circumstances, and the way that in this evening we're specifically going to be looking at family influences that do shape the way that a child acts, reacts, and thinks. So let's jump into it. Shaping influences are the events and circumstances during the developmental years that act as the catalyst for making a child the person that he is. However, the shaping is not automatic. The way that he responds to these events and circumstances determines the effects that they have on him. Perfect illustration that hits close to home. We have a mom who makes a chore list for all three of her sons. That's a great picture for our house. Mom, 3 sons, and so day after day, week over week, she makes the chore list. Now, this is not what happened. We're just pretending this is what happened, all right? Same circumstances. Mom makes a chore list for each child. But let's say that one over time, and when he becomes an adult, develops a bitterness at all women and will not let anyone tell him what to do, because ultimately he became bitter at his mother for always leaving a list and telling him what to do. Then there was another son who became a sluggard because in his mind, all he ever did at home was work. And then we have another child who has a proper attitude. He uses the assignments that were given to him to develop character and responsibility, and he becomes successful in the workforce and also in family relationships. Same shaping influence, same chore list that came day after day, different responses, different outcomes. What I want to see is that the Bible deals and gives us many passages. We're going to look at 3 specifically this evening that deal with how we ought to deal with early childhood development. The first place we're going to look is Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 20. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 20. And so what I don't want to, or never mind, we'll develop this line upon line. Deuteronomy 6 verse 20. Notice this. And when thy son asketh thee in the time to come, saying, what mean the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments which the Lord our God hath commanded you? So here we have a father being asked a question by a son. Dad, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we go to the temple? Why do we have to do these things that the Lord told us? I haven't heard the Lord speak audibly to me ever, but we're following Moses, we're following Joshua. How come we have to do all of these things? God says, here's what you tell your son. Then thou shalt say unto thy son, we were Pharaoh's bondmen in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Notice how literally each verse is going to remind us what the Lord said, what the Lord asked us to do, what the Lord, it's not about what men say to do with child rearing, it's about what the Lord said. And the Lord showed signs and wonders and great and sore upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, and upon all the household before our eyes. And he brought us out from thence, that he might bring us in, to give us the land which he sware unto our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as it is at this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. There's another passage we find, a very common passage, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Also Colossians chapter 3. Notice this, we literally have a verse for each person involved. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. I think it's interesting in both of those passages that it says, fathers, specifically, don't provoke your children to anger. Servants, obey in all things your masters. And it goes on and it just starts laying out the proper order in different areas. So what we see in these passages, and we could look at so many more, but what we see is parenting and teaching children is a two-way street. The person that a child is becoming is a product of two things. One, his life experiences, but two, how he interacts with that experience. A child is not merely acted upon by the circumstances of life, he reacts, and he reacts according to the Godward orientation of his heart. So you may say, well, my child, my teenager, they're fine until, we go somewhere else. We go to the grocery store, and then they just, lose it. Or, whenever they go on an overnight trip, then they go nuts. The problem may not necessarily be the circumstances or the change in schedule. It may be that their heart is turned away from you or turned away from the Lord. But as parents and teachers, we can help them turn it back to God towards obedience. So what we're going to see is there are 6 shaping influences, at least in a family. It's not an exhaustive list, but it covers some of the most powerful things that are going to shape a child's life. Number 1 is the structure of a family. We're going to bring all of this. It's just kind of a lot of information, but then we're going to bring all of this together for a conclusion. The structure of a family. So, how is the family put together? And we know that this is something that we talk with Tucker a lot about as we begin to give him more and more information and piece together some of the pieces of our family and how the Lord put it together. My wife says, Tucker, God is the one who puts a family together. And ultimately he is. Whether all of your children are biologically born into your family, whether some are added through adoption or through foster care or whatever it is, whether a family has 1 active parent, 2, none, grandparents, whatever it is, God ultimately is the one that puts a family together. So, is that family a traditional family? Now, what we're finding today is what we know as a traditional family is actually becoming untraditional. And for a mom and a dad to be married, never divorced, and to have children, and to go all the way through their high school year and then to graduate out with the same 2 parents, that's more abnormal than it is normal now, unfortunately. But that would be considered maybe a traditional family. How many generations are present? I had a great opportunity to be raised where we had Granny Moore, Grandma and Papa, Mom and Dad, myself, and now for a short time there were 5 generations of the Rogers Moore family. That's generally more of the exception than the normal. Are both parents alive and functioning in the home? How many children are there? How close are the children in age? The structure of a family strongly influences a child's life. Parents and their involvement are the most powerful, but you can't discredit other factors as well. Think about this from maybe a practical illustration. You have an only child who marries maybe a child who comes from a family of 5 or 6, right? So let's say Janice, she was an only child. And she marries Bob, who was in the middle of 6 siblings. They're going to come into marriage with, ultimately because of the way their families worked, totally different expectations, right? It just totally shaped some of their needs and some of their expectations. So Janice, the only child, maybe is disappointed because Bob didn't just totally organize his every waking moment around her. As the only child, she just expected, he'd come home from work, and then the whole evening would just be, about her, and he'd bring her home a gift every evening and orient his life around her desires. Bob maybe became frustrated at Janice's neediness, right? Because he isn't necessarily used to that. Bob was happy to get a scrap at the table if there was anything left after his older brothers and sisters went through the line. And he had a lot of friendships, both with his siblings and also with his siblings and their friends. And he enjoyed the little bit of one-on-one time that he did get, if he ever did get it, with one of his parents. And Bob sometimes enjoyed a little quiet time away. So ultimately, Bob and Janice's family structure profoundly shaped their needs and their expectations in life and marriage. Now, is Bob justified, or is Janice justified to holler and yell and demand things of one another? Absolutely not. I'm not saying that a shaping influence gives the right for someone to be ungodly, but it does shape some of the way that people think and expect. Number 2, family values. Colossians 2, verse 8. Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. So family values, this is the biggest one. What's important to the parents? Are people more important than things? What philosophies and ideas does the child hear? Are children to be seen and not heard? What are the unspoken family rules? Where does God fit into the family? Is the family life organized around knowing and loving God, or is church simply an obligation before they can go to the beach on Sunday? There can be a difference, don't miss this, there can be a difference between the family values that a family wants to have and ultimately the family values that are lived in a home. Well, how do I know that? Well, say you have a little bit older children. Ask one of your teenagers, what would be worse, breaking your dad's golf clubs or disobeying a direct order from dad? If the child said, oh, if I broke one of dad's golf clubs, I don't even want to know what would happen. But I might be able to get away with if I don't directly, if I directly disobey him, I might get away with it. Ultimately, whether dad says obedience is number one, what's being conveyed and ultimately lived is that things are more important than obedience or virtue. Other aspects of family values: what are the boundaries within the family? What secrets are kept? What secrets are told? Some families never share any troubles with children and just totally insulate them. Other families, on the way home from church, it's, just spout out all of the things that we don't like about pastor and the people at church, and just kind of dump out the garbage can and paw through it on the way home, and children pick up on that big time. Some children grow up and leave home without ever knowing how much money is in the home. Others know what the checkbook balance is. So there's just so many different things. Number 3, family roles. Is dad involved in every aspect of daily life, or is he busy and distant or totally not involved whatsoever? Dad's involvement at home profoundly shapes the way that a child, especially a way that a young man, is going to operate through life. Who pays the bills? Who makes the appointments? What's the child's role? This is so interesting, right? Because God says the role in the family and the way that it's ordered is God, and father submitted to God, wife submitted to husband, and children submitted to parents and God. Satan says children are number 1, and then mom, and then dad, and then God. Satan takes everything that God said this is what we do, and he just flips it upside down. And so the family roles, it's very easy to say, well, we just want our children to have a good family, experience. I want them to have, the things that I never did. And in catering to them so much, we can try to give them such a good life that really we allow them to be in a role that doesn't belong to them. We allow them to be king rather than child, and that is not going to serve them well long term, whether we think it will or not. Number 4, family conflict resolution. Ephesians 4:26, be angry and sin not. It's not a sin to be angry. It's a sin to be angry and then curse. It's a sin to be angry and then throw something at your wife. It's a sin to be angry and then storm out. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, sentence, thought doesn't end there, neither give place to the devil. So what does that mean then? That means then if there is unresolved conflict allowed to be in the home, what does that do? It gives place to the devil, right? And so it's so important. He said, how do you want to invite the devil into your home? Have unresolved conflict. mom and dad go to bed back to back? Does the family know how to talk about problems? Not gossip about problems, but talk through them. Have the uncomfortable conversation. I learned very quickly, just being totally transparent, I learned very quickly that I'm non-confrontational. And I'm living with a very confrontational wife. And so all of us, I thought that just kind of giving in or just, sweeping the argument under the rug was the way to deal with it. There, oh, here's a possibility for an argument, just put that away. And what I realized like 6 months in is, okay, actually what I'm doing now is I'm allowing my wife to run the home. She now is functioning in a role that was not mine, not necessarily by her, that was not hers, not necessarily by any fault of her own, but I was not doing what I was supposed to do, and therefore the roles were totally reversed in the home. And so what I had to realize is I have to be willing to have the difficult conversation. I have to be willing to say, honey, this is what I believe God wants us to do, and this is what the Word of God says about it, and this is what we're going to do. And be willing to have the difficult and converse about it, not be a dictator. But, so think about this. This is funny. There was a little boy, talking about conflict resolution. Little boy was in kindergarten. Every time the teacher said, Johnny, you need to stop doing that, and he would get mad at the teacher and he would storm out of the classroom, run away down the hall. So this happened time after time. It got to a point where Johnny was running out of the classroom a lot whenever he got angry at the teacher. And so teacher called in mom and dad. And she brought the problem to mom and dad and said, this is the issue. I think the problem is he doesn't know how to deal with conflict and whatnot. Well, dad got really upset at the teacher, and he stormed out of the room. The teacher gained a better understanding of why Johnny was behaving the way that he was behaving. He was learning that this is how I deal with conflict. Storming out and leaving conflict unresolved is not the way to deal with it. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. A fool's wrath is presently known, but a prudent man covereth shame. So we're talking about shaping influences. A child is trained either to be a fool or a wise man in the area of conflict resolution by the example that we set in the home and the classroom. A couple more and we're going to conclude and we'll be done here. We didn't start until like quarter after, so I get till quarter after. Number 5, family response to failure. How do parents respond to a child's failure? This is huge. How do parents respond to their own failures? Are children or spouses made to feel foolish or stupid? You're so dumb, I can't believe you did this. Can you imagine how damaging that is to say to a child? But maybe even in jest, or maybe seriously, but that said from one spouse to another, that falls on, even at 4 and 5 years old, our children are picking up on all kinds of things. And they're repeating things back, and you say, that's not good to say. Where'd you hear that? You said it, Dad. I was like, oh, okay. Great. So it's so important, the words that we say, especially in this area of failure. Are children and spouses mocked for failure? Do family members find amusement at the expense of other family members? Praise and criticism, or the lack thereof, will greatly shape a child's life. Some people, they become very, very successful businessmen or women, and sometimes they do literally because, and you'll hear the testimonies, hey, what drives you? What drove you to become so successful? And they'll literally say, my dad said I would never amount to anything, or my mom said I couldn't, or a teacher, whatever. And that one criticism just drove them to success. So really, really impactful. Unfortunately, for every example of criticism that drove someone to quote-unquote success, you have thousands of examples of ones that drove them to drink or to suicide or to giving up and dropping out of church, not caring about anything. Lastly, family history. Family members are born and others die. There are marriages and divorces. There's plenty of money and not enough money. There's health and chronic illness. And some have deep roots in a community. Others are constantly moving. And of course, all of those things also are massive shaping influences on the life of a child. So We're going to look at two mistakes of understanding those influences. Two mistakes are made when understanding the shaping influences and circumstances of a child's life. Number one is seeing them deterministically. Seeing them deterministically. This is the error of assuming that a child is a helpless victim of their circumstance in which they were raised. Meaning, well, Johnny, he was born into, a quote-unquote bad home, therefore he'll never amount to anything. Or the flip side of it, right? Johnny was born into a good home, therefore he's going to be a good kid. According to the Word of God, there is no such thing as a good kid, right? According to Jeremiah 17:6, our hearts are deceitfully wicked, and we all, born in good, perfect situation or terrible situation, must have our hearts turned towards God, and through salvation and sanctification, good home, bad home, or anywhere in between, can turn out exactly the way that God has for them. So seeing those circumstances deterministically, meaning their circumstances ultimately determine what they're going to be. But number two is denial, which is the total flip side of it, meaning it's the mistake of saying that a child is totally unaffected by his childhood experiences. Well, it doesn't matter, that's just dumb. As long as he's got God, that's all he needs. Yes, that is true. Also, though, it's foolish to not understand that the way that a child is raised, the things that he sees, the things that he hears, the things that he experiences, are going to shape and mold the way that he thinks. So, a biblical perspective of influence. We need to understand these things biblically. This will greatly aid us in both parenting and teaching. Here's where it is, and we're done. We make a grave mistake if we conclude that child rearing is nothing more than providing the best possible influences for your children. How many times do you hear, someone who's talking about their children who maybe are towards the end of their schooling, or maybe they're in college, or they're a young adult and they've just totally gone away from the Lord, or maybe gotten to themselves in deep trouble, and you hear a parent say this, well, I had them in church. Many Christian parents adopt Christian determinism, which is this: assuming if they can protect and shelter a child well enough, always be positive with him, send him to a Christian school, bring them to church, and provide the best possible childhood experience, their child will turn out well. These parents and teachers are sure that a proper environment will produce a proper child. That is not true. We have seen young people come from broken homes and difficult situations where your heart breaks for them and you think, there is no way in the world that Johnny, Susie has any chance of making it. And what do? They defy all odds. Their heart is turned towards God. They go through a youth group. They get married. They have children. Their children are in church. And they are functioning in life, in society, and church. You have other children who are raised in what would be considered the perfect home, a pastor's home, a deacon's home, and they go through church and their heart is never turned towards God. It's turned away from God. And as soon as they leave home and go out into the world, they just totally blow out. And you think, what is going on? And Pastor Wilkerson says often, there is no such thing as blowouts in the Christian life, only slow leaks. And that's so true. That child's heart was always turned away from God, and regardless of the perfect situation that he was in, and the Sunday school class that he was in, and the Christian school that he was in, he decided that he was not going to do what God had for him. This thought, talking about if I provide the right things for him, he's going to turn out well, is unbiblical and is a social utopian way of thinking. That's what the socialists say, right? Well, if you can just provide, if they were raised in a vacuum and never had anything bad happening, then they wouldn't do anything wrong. Jesus said there's nothing outside that goes in that'll defile them. What defiles them is already in, and that comes out. If a child knows and loves God, if he understands that knowing God enables him to have peace in any circumstance in life, he will respond constructively to your shaping efforts. If a child does not know and love God, the child may rebel against your best efforts. We must do all God has called us to do as parents and teachers, but the outcome is more complex than good in, good out, bad in, bad out. People aren't machines. They're not robots. You cannot program your child to become what you want them to be. You can direct their heart towards God and pray that they will be what God wants them to be. A child's response is his responsibility, and it's our responsibility as parents to direct their hearts towards God. Proverbs 4:23, our text verse, and we'll look at a couple of personal questions for reflection. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So a couple of questions to ask yourself, parents and teachers. What would your children identify as the values of your family? If you're not sure, ask them. Say, son, daughter, what are the values of our family? Now, most of us with the young children, our 4 or 5 year olds don't even know what the word value means. So, but ask yourself, what are the values that I want to see in our home? And then ask yourself the next question: are we ultimately living those things? It's one thing to want those things; it's another thing to live those things. 2, where are the secrets in your home? Do you share too much and burden the children, or do you share too little and insulate them? 3, what constitutes success or failure in your home? Do you know what does, and do your children know? Sometimes parents will say, hey, it doesn't matter what score you get, just do your best. I don't want to see any more C's. Okay, it's like, okay, so that's kind of talking out of both ends of your mouth. So to you, what constitutes success? Is it an A, or is it best effort? And you ultimately have to decide that. Do you tend to be a determinist in the way that you look at child rearing? Are you able to see that your children are active responders to the shaping influences in their life?